Okay, do I have your permission to record, Professor?
Yes, you do. And call me Frank.
Okay, Frank. Okay. Well, today for our listeners, we have an interview with Frank FH Buckley. He is a professor at George Mason School of Law. He also taught at, I believe it's called the McGill School University of Law in Canada. He's a senior writer for American Spectator, where he recently wrote an article called American Breakup, which was about his new book, which will be released, I believe, in 1 week from today, called American Secession. Professor Frank, did I get anything wrong? How would you like to introduce yourself? What other background?
Oh, you did fine. What may be relevant was that I was simply a Canadian until 2014 and became a U.S. citizen in that year. So now I'm a dual. The reason why that might be relevant is because in Canada I've had some experience with secession movements.
That was the thing that grabbed me, was that in the article, and then I looked at the web page for the book American Secession coming up soon. That's to be released this month for everybody listening in. And you were proposing, what I saw was that maybe America could look at the Quebec model, and I found that interesting because you had law backgrounds and had taught law at universities in both America and Canada.
Yeah. You're not coming in absolutely clearly, but yes, I thought that at very least the idea that a secession movement here would necessarily be unconstitutional was somewhat naive, and I gave several ways in which secession might actually happen in America.
I recall that one of the people on your book webpage was Sanford Levinson. I believe he's a professor of law out of Texas. And he too, if I'm
Yeah.
not mistaken, had said it's not a closed, shut case that you can't secede. Am I saying that incorrectly?
Well, I'm not sure if Sandy Levinson would put it that way, but what he has argued for some years is that things we regard as constitutionally impossible are indeed quite possible, and he concentrates on things like nullification and interposition. The idea that states still have rights which have not been submerged by the federal government, and that includes the right to disregard federal laws.
So let's get right into the meat of this. Can a state secede, and if so, how?
Well, there are a couple of ways in which that might happen. I won't talk about what might provoke this.
Sure. Fair enough.
Okay, but for starters, the idea that we'd be necessarily met with an Abraham Lincoln in office, I think, is naive. I don't know what would happen with a President Trump or with a Democratic president, but I think it's unlikely we'd see the strange constellation of events which led to the war in April of 1861. I think we'd be more likely to find a James Buchanan in office than an Abraham Lincoln. I mean, there there are many things you can say about Buchanan. He was he stood out as a racist at a time when everybody was a racist.
Right.
But in his fourth State of the Union message to Congress, what he said was, look, the South doesn't have a reason to secede, and it doesn't have the right to secede, but what do you want me to do? And as he noted, the framers themselves thought that it would be impermissible for the federal government to make war on a state. But yet, when my Alexandria, Virginia was invaded in April 1861, it was federal troops that occupied my town.
Right.
So I don't see that happening. I think it's more, that's not been the experience in too many other countries that have gone through a secession. I mean, people might say, oh, it's necessarily going to be Yugoslavia and that sort of thing. No, it would be more likely to be something like Canada, which would be a peaceful movement towards secession. That's what I experienced in Quebec, and that's, I think, what would happen in America. I mean, were a state to want out, you'd see the U-Haul company doing a lot of business, but I don't think you'd see tanks moving in.
I never thought that either, especially when you looked at Brexit and the Scottish vote for devolution, that, say what you will, but they were largely handled peacefully. You have New Caledonia, which is part of France, and they're having a resolution. And then Greenland, I think, with Denmark. So I just got the sense that the Western world is past that. We're at this point where we can have votes for the way you want to go. But then Spain and Catalan, they very quickly put up a wall that seemed very totalitarian versus classical liberalism.
And we're faulted for that. Heavens knows what a President Trump would do if California wanted out. I mean, anything is possible with him, but one possibility would be something like, don't let the door hit you on the way out.
That's what,
I mean,
yes.
Looking at the electoral, I think one thing any president would do would be to look at the electoral map and calculate whether this would be for the advantage or disadvantage of his party. But I should say one thing. I mean, my book said two things. One, it's possible to see a secession movement succeed, number one. Number two, I hope that wouldn't happen.
Fair enough.
And, and there are two ways in which we might lower the stakes all around. One would be for extremists on both sides to lower the stakes. We're in the middle of a cultural war, and I think the people fighting that war have thought it would win, it would conclude with total victory for their side.
Yep.
And, I just don't see that happening, not on one side, not on the other side. So, one possibility would be for everyone to chill, take a Valium, cool down, and compromise. The other possibility, if that didn't work, would be some form of constitutional convention which would amount to, larger scale devolution than we've seen with American federalism for many, many years. And I think that's the most likely result. I mean, this would end up probably in the Supreme Court. And I don't think the Supreme Court would say that there's unilateral right of secession. And I don't think it would say that a vote for secession is meaningless. And I think what I'm pointing to, therefore, is something like the Canadian solution, which is, we're sort of an in-between world, and people need to talk things out. So if there were, for example, a secession, you might want to do it on the basis of some form of free trade within the present United States. That's something that would be worked out in a constitutional convention.
So you're suggesting... I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, if California wants to go its own way in some respects, fine. But it would then be a matter of negotiation as to, what would remain of the country. I mean, we might end up with something like Europe today under the EU. There are any number of possibilities. What Quebec wanted was something called sovereignty association, which would not be independence, but where there might be free movement of people and goods across the country.
Yeah, they have a lot of powers, if I'm not mistaken. Much more than the rest of Canada. They have sort of an exceptional range of powers and freedom that aren't given to the other. I think they're provincial states in Canada. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, you are. Although it's not so much a matter of right, constitutional right, as a matter of, as it is a matter of concession by the rest of Canada to Quebec. So, for example, Quebec gets its own immigration policy.
Okay.
Which means, which every province has, by the way, which means basically, the federal government determines how many people get admitted, and each province says this is how many we'll take. And there are mechanisms to deal with provinces that might cheat on that. But, so that's one possibility. And when you consider that, much of our politics is consumed by immigration questions, where some states are very open and some states not at all to immigrants, that'd be one way of making us a lot less angry at each other.
So you're saying that, hey, and I think I saw this in the article again at spectator.us. It's called American Breakup by FH Buckley, where he talks about the possibility of American secession. But he also says, hey, maybe don't go that far. Maybe.
Yeah, well.
Look at Quebec, right?
Well, when you think about it, I think most people would not want to go that far. In other words, they might not want a passport to go to La Jolla if they live in Virginia. And then there are, by the way, a lot of messy questions concerning the U.S. fleet in San Diego or the submarine base in Washington State. It would be a call for people to sit down and have a serious discussion rather than just, have people kind of yell at each other. So,
Yeah.
I'd like to see, if part of the problem is the cultural war, one solution is devolution.
Do you believe, I'm going to pull a little bit from your background here. You have been a speechwriter, I believe, on 2 occasions for current American President Donald Trump. Do you think this is something that Trump may be theoretically open to? Say, hey, California, we don't get along. We're not going to blame someone. You obviously think I'm all bad. I think you're all bad. I mean, you can read the New York Times articles talking about California and America, Trump fighting with each other. Trump says, let's stop fighting. Here, you want your own immigration powers, trade, and to protect your land? Take it. And that would calm things down?
I've written with my wife a number of speeches for Trump as candidate.
Okay.
I don't have any idea how he would react in those circumstances. But
Fair enough.
I think it's less than likely that you'd be seeing cruise missiles flying over Sacramento. I think it's more likely that you'd see the deal maker emerge. Right? I mean, this is an opportunity for deal making. And there are sensible deals to be made, okay? And they include many of the issues in the culture wars. So, part of the problem, I think, has to do with one side assuming that you require uniformity across the entire country, when in fact it's only part of the country that wants what that side wants.
Right.
So Horace Greeley said, let the erring sisters depart in peace. And I say, well, don't let them just depart, but let them have their own way on some issues.
I'm not an expert, but from the reading I have done on Quebec and Canada, things got a little heated in the 60s and 70s. There was some real friction where the people of Quebec wanted more independence and freedom. And the legal allowance they got from the Canadian government did seem to calm down this friction between English-speaking Canada and French-speaking Canada. Is that a fair statement?
Well, it's rather complicated. At a time when there was rising Quebec nationalism and there didn't seem to be a way of expressing that, you had some bombs set off in 1963, and then you had a crisis in 1970 where a cabinet minister was kidnapped and subsequently killed.
Wow.
And that stopped when Pierre Trudeau called up the troops. Tanks patrolled downtown Montreal, and about 500 people were briefly put into jail. The War Measures Act was invoked, which suspended the right of habeas corpus in the province. So he reacted really strongly. Civil libertarians got really upset about this throughout the country, but it put an end to it. But what really put an end to it was the victory of a separatist government in 1976. So, I mean, what I'm describing is the level of frustration that can emerge when you don't have a democratic outlet for that. Once you have a democratic outlet, all the terrorism just completely disappeared, and now the issue became politicized. So, that's what would happen here. You wouldn't see terrorism, but you'd see rather a democratic movement in favor of either federalism or secession. Tibet rose to that. It's easy to imagine a scenario in which Trump wins a second term, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg goes the way of all flesh, and several more members are added to the Supreme Court, and now Roe v. Wade is in question. So so it's easy to imagine the level of tension being ratcheted up, and the people who up to this point have assumed that they have property rights in culture and morality, all of a sudden, they realize that they don't. I mean, part of, I think what is going to make secession look more tempting to people is people who thought they could win politically now will find that they can't.
Right.
And that the deplorables have a voice themselves and can win elections. So if that's the case, then, the level of anger and resentment from progressives, which is to escalate completely. As it is right now, the Antifa people and Tifa people are not regarded as extreme by some on the left. I think they're crazy. You might see a bit more of that, and that's the sort of thing which would lead to, again, I think not armed conflict, but we're not going to have a civil war, obviously. But it could easily lead to demands for states to go the wrong way. And in fact, they do that. Right? At this point, there's a lot of interposition going on. There are a lot of democratic states that don't want to enforce federal laws. Oregon, with respect to ICE, sanctuary laws in California, that's interposition. And, that's kind of pushing it as far as you can. But ICE still operates in California.
I remember. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And to back you up, I remember, because I'm born and raised here, and I was in Sacramento the day after the election in 2016. Californians lost their mind. I'm not joking. I'm not exaggerating. People were walking around in the streets crying, sobbing, and just literally bent over on the sidewalk crying because Donald Trump won election. We lost it. And if he wins again, it is not going to be handled well. It will not be handled maturely. Rational heads are not going to prevail here. They're going to be mad. And when Trump won in 2016, you had immediately 1/3 of California, according to Reuters and Stanford, two different polls, January 2017, right after he gets elected, 1/3 of the world's fifth largest economy says, let's secede right now. Not tomorrow, not talk, which is shocking to have that many people say, I don't mean discuss, I mean do it. But when you look at those surveys, they both showed there was an additional percentage of people who weren't against it but didn't know how they felt, meaning maybe they would be convinced if there was a discussion. And that was around 15%. So you're looking at Stanford and Reuters right after Trump gets elected, showing about 47% of Californians are open to secession because the man was elected. So he gets reelected. I can only imagine where they're going to be. And what I found interesting was that you had many conservatives say, oh, is that your threat? Go ahead and go. Wayne Allen Root said that. John Stossel on Reason Magazine, Pat Buchanan. And what they were getting at was, if you don't like being part of America so bad you can't handle it with one election, then go ahead and go California, because conservatives in America would let you go. If it's a vote in Congress that you need, here, let us give it to you, because We view it as conservatives as our ability to ensure victories in the future.
Yeah. Well, there are two possibilities when that happens. One possibility would be for progressives to say, we have to compromise. We agree about drag queen story hour in kindergarten, in grade school.
I've seen that. We do that out here. It's a little extreme.
I'm taking extreme example.
It happens. It is extreme. It does happen. We do it out here. It is extreme.
Yeah, so that's, one possibility is, we overstepped the mark. Let's talk, let's compromise on cultural issues. And the other possibility is ratcheting it up in terms of movements towards secession. And as I said, if this ended up in the Supreme Court on a motion to secede, what you wouldn't see, I think, is the Supreme Court saying there is no right of secession.
Wow.
In part because, if you're an originalist, you'll look back at what the framers were doing in 1787, and you'll realize they were completely open to secession.
Right.
Madison agreed with that.
Right.
So there's a whole literature that's been about all this. It's been kind of forgotten, and one reason was because secession 1.0 was such a horrible, painful, war, and because it was right to fight the Civil War. I mean, the South deserved to lose.
Right. But, of course.
But that's not California.
True.
So it's therefore more likely in those cases that we'd be left in a gray zone, which is exactly where the Canadian Supreme Court ended up, which held, well, there's no unilateral right to secede, but we can't ignore the democratic wishes of the state. And so, at that point, what California would likely do would be to call a convention of the states under Article 5 of the Constitution, which would try to work out some deal which would amount to greater devolution. Which is by way of saying not one side nor the other will completely win the cultural wars, but instead we're going to find some states committed to go their own way on some issues. And it might be for California immigration, and it might be for Alabama abortion, but whatever it is, it won't be a uniform, one-size-fits-all constitutional regime for the entire country.
Here in California, they don't like Trump and they like doing their own thing. But if you really focus down, they're not that upset about U.S. military bases here, even though they don't approve of all the wars and they protested Vietnam and stuff. What seems to get them...
I'm shocked.
Yeah. Californians protested the Iraq War. They protested the Vietnam War. Absolutely, they're anti-war. But if you go, hey, do you hate that military base right there that those people come out and buy goods in your local community? They're not going to say yes. They're kind of it's a weird dynamic. They're like, yeah, no wars, but those are good boys over there.
One thing I point out in my book is that if California weren't required to commit to the U.S. defense budget, that would be enough to pay for a national health system in California.
Yes. Oh, you said that. That's awesome. If California...
I worked out the numbers from the LA Times. I think that's accurate.
Oh, that's excellent.
And, by the way, coming from Canada, I'd have no particular problem with that. I mean, the Canadian system is underfunded, but if you fund it properly, it's fine, okay? If you fund it the way the Swiss do, the system would work fine. But anyway, let different states go their own way on this.
What about a simple amendment? Instead of a full-on convention, just a scenario. The conservative-dominated Senate says, hey, California, you clearly, it's not working. You want out. We want to make things more calm. We're going to pass an amendment that gives you some devolved powers, say immigration, trade, and your own air, water, quality racks. You get those, and then you be quiet and stop complaining. and they're able to get that
Yeah.
passed.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, those would be the kind of details to be worked out. And yes, it would get very messy. For example, if California had its own immigration system, what would that do to the right of free transit of people across the United States? Could you move? This is a problem with the Quebec immigration system, essentially.
Right.
So, there are horrible, mind-numbing kinds of details to be worked out, and it would require, hopefully, the intelligence of the people of that the framers displayed in 1787 to work out a deal that would work for everyone. But that would be no more than, in fact, the kind of government we had back when, which was largely government by the states.
True.
And that included horrible things like slavery.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
But
of course.
We're not looking at that today. One reason why secession would be more attractive to some people today is we're not looking, I think, we're not looking at anything like slavery. And I think the civil rights revolution has taken hold across the country, so we're not going to see any backtrack on that. And it's also the case that while there are divisions within a state, that was true of the South as well. That was true of Virginia in 1861. Virginia held 3 votes on secession, and Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were Unionists.
Right.
And so the first 2 votes, the Unionists won, and then the idiots in South Carolina fired on Fort Sumter, and Lincoln called up the troops, and that was that.
I do have to point out to everybody. Yes, I'm a Californian. Yes, slavery was horrible. I absolutely support Lincoln and soldiers of the North defeating it. At the same time, 2 key facts: 1812, New Hampshire or Connecticut, I forget, one of those 2, held talks with the British king about seceding from America and rejoining them. No one came after them. No one was imprisoned. They were criticized in the paper. That was it. Nobody said that's illegal.
That was the Hartford Convention, and
yes.
And in fact, they had reason, the Federalists in New England, to oppose the war. They didn't like the war. And from an American perspective, it was a bad war. It was an imperialistic war, for our sakes. So,
yes.
Which I, back in 5 years ago, I would have said, which America lost. Okay.
You have these Americans saying, we want to secede, and nobody in 1812 says that's illegal.
Yeah. And of course they wouldn't have. I mean, for a number of reasons. The federal government was so small, there wasn't that much to secede from. One thing that makes secession a bit more difficult is how big the federal footprint is. So it makes it difficult to extract from the Union, but also it makes it at the same time more tempting to do so, to get rid of that kind of Brussels-type overextension of power by the central government. I mean, Brexit was a secession,
right?
And a deregulatory move from Brussels. And California is big enough to go its own way in that respect as well. I mean, you have enough. Gosh, you have enough bureaucrats in Sacramento to mimic anything the federal government does.
Thank you.
If you like regulation.
Thank you for saying that. I have been saying that for a while. You're the first person I've heard bring this up in any sort of academic sense, that the amount of money California spends on the military, it could have single-payer health care like that, and facts like this. That's awesome. Thank you for doing that. It's not brought up.
Sure.
It's just not brought up.
You remember the book's available on Amazon.
I will. The book is called American Secession. It is available on Amazon this week. Also check out American Breakup on spectator.us. That's FH Buckley. Professor, real quick, before you go, hypothetical scenario. California, the governor of California goes to the Republican Party and says, hey, You guys show that you're willing to pass an amendment giving us a couple extra rights like Quebec, and we'd be willing to not vote in the presidential election. We still keep the Senate and the House, but you want to have future elections without California impact on the Electoral College? Fine. In return, we get more freedoms. Do you think that's something the Republicans may go for, Professor? I understand this is hypothetical.
They might, but you have to understand how this would have to happen. I think you'd require a successful referendum in California.
Okay.
And then I think you'd require a constitutional convention to hammer out some of the details. Because the promise by a governor of California not to let its electoral votes count is constitutionally questionable. I mean,
Right.
The electors can be instructed by the governor, but the promise is not enforceable. Okay? So you can make the promise and then break it.
Oh,
And there's no
yes.
reason.
Yeah, I'm saying that they would pass one amendment at the federal level, and California agrees. We give up the Electoral College votes, but in return we get immigration and trade and what have you.
Exactly. Yeah, that would obviously be very tempting to any Republican smart enough to count numbers in the Electoral College.
Okay.
And you can be sure that Trump and Jared Kushner know how to do that.
Yes. Any websites, last statements you'd like people to think about or consider, or places to contact you if you would like to be contacted, Professor Frank?
Well, the best way to contact me is email, and the email is on my website. The website is fhbuckley.com, and the email is fbuckley@gmu.edu, George Mason University. And apart from that, like I say, the book's available on Amazon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.